Another long gospel in Lent from the Gospel of John, another great story, another great conversation, another deep theological teaching of Jesus. We had Nicodemus the Pharisee earlier in Lent. We had the woman at the well last week in that conversation. And now we have Jesus healing a blind man and reflecting on what this means. The irony in this story is that everybody in the story is blind in one way or another. The disciples, when they see this blind man, they say, "Who sinned, this man or his parents?" Right? Because if you see someone who's blind, it must be a curse. Somebody sinned and God is punishing them with blindness. That was common wisdom of the day. I think it still lurks in our common collective unconsciousness that when bad things happen, we kind of deserve it or it gets passed on. That was what they thought. They were blind to this man's suffering because they saw it as possibly divine retribution. The neighbors of the blind man were also blind. You know, they couldn't have told you his name. He was just the blind guy. And in fact, when he started walking around and could see, they didn't recognize him, did they? Some did, but maybe it just looks like him. We're not sure if it's the guy, because to those neighbors, they weren't good neighbors because they never really saw him as a full human being. He was just the guy you stepped over, and every once in a while you might throw him a shekel. The Pharisees in the story are also blind, and perhaps the most blind. Now, the Pharisees in the Gospels get a bad rap. These were, many of them, deeply faithful, committed religious people trying to do their best to follow God's commandments. But in this case, their adherence to the law prevented them from really seeing and appreciating the miracle that was right in front of them. They interrogated the man twice. They interrogated his parents. They were looking for a reason to condemn him and to condemn Jesus, because they had already made up their minds that Jesus was an enemy. And so this man must also be an enemy. There must be some trick. This must be some kind of con. And they were out to find the answer. In all of the story, the only person who sees clearly, well, Jesus, but the only other person is the blind man himself. That's the wonderful irony in the story. All the people who can see are blind, and the one man who is blind can see clearly. Because at the end, he is the one who says, "I believe," and he worships Jesus. The story is so important because it gives us insight into a universal human tendency that I think we all need to acknowledge and struggle with. Psychologists call it confirmation bias. We all think that we are objective people, right? You're all rational, sane, objective people. You're not swayed by advertisements. You're not swayed by political rhetoric. You can look at the facts and make up your mind and be objective, right? Who here? No, don't tell me. I'll tell you. That's not true. All of us suffer from confirmation bias. These are unconscious biases that come from who we are, right? I happen to be born at a certain place and time, in a certain family, in a certain location, in a certain culture. I happen to be a straight white man who was born in 1965 in Southern California. All of that helps to shape my worldview, and it leads me to look at the world from a certain perspective, often totally unconsciously. I was last week at a class that our local group of churches is doing called People of Faith. Highly recommend it. There's a class every month, some are on Zoom, some are in person. And it's really looking at exploring how do we really come to learn and appreciate worldviews that are different from our own? How can we reflect more deeply on the language that we use, on the sort of assumptions that we make about who people are and what they're like? It was very revealing and very helpful. Father John also shared with me an article on the same topic, but from another point of view, talking about how when we try to enforce rules about how to use language, we can sometimes get all twisted up, right? It's complicated. Look, for example, at the recent problem that happened with the Silicon Valley Bank, right? You've all heard and read about Silicon Valley Bank, made all the news. They went belly up. And before the dust had settled, everybody had an opinion about what caused this, right? Most people having no idea about how banking works, no idea about economics, but everybody had an opinion. And on the one side, the opinion was, well, of course, this was because of deregulation of the banks, right? So on the left, the argument was, the conservatives have deregulated the banks. Banks are making risky bets. This is the logical conclusion of conservative policies. On the right, this bank collapsed because of wokeness. This was a woke bank. They made woke decisions, and therefore the bank failed, right? I venture to say that neither of those explanations is fully true, but they say a lot about the people who leap to those conclusions, right? And we all do this in different ways. In our gospel today, everybody has an opinion about this blind man. His parents are even blind. They're afraid of being thrown out of the synagogue. Even they won't really stick up for him. You better talk to him if you want to find out the answer. They want to stay out of the fray completely out of fear. We, I think, have an invitation to reflect on our confirmation biases, all those implicit biases, to look at ourselves and to ask, how might I be more open to different points of view? It takes a kind of change of mindset. It takes an openness and a curiosity. When something happens, instead of rushing to judgment, we might want to pause and ask some questions. I've gone through several big changes of mind in my life because of people that I met. I think when this most often happens, it's because of a relationship that we have with someone, a trusted relationship that creates the openness to see things in a different way. When I was a kid, I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and I somehow absorbed the idea that women clergy were an abomination unto the Lord. Right? There shouldn't be, I mean, we could have women acolytes. There was a nun who used to help teach Sunday school. That was okay. But I was firm in my convictions at the age of wisdom, right? I was 15. I knew it all. At 15, I knew that God did not want there to be women clergy. And then we got a seminarian from Yale Divinity School who was there for a year, and she worked with our youth group, and she read lessons and she preached sermons, and I developed a huge crush on this woman. She was gorgeous, and she was full of grace. When she spoke, when she taught, she reflected the presence of God and the Holy Spirit. And because of getting to know her, my experience changed. Suddenly, I had to step back and go, if I say that there shouldn't be women clergy, then this woman who is so full of grace shouldn't be a priest. And suddenly there was this cognitive dissonance in my mind, and my preconceived ideas met up with a new experience, and it helped me to change my mind. This happened again for me over the issue of homosexuality, because I was convinced at the age of 15 that it was a terrible thing. It's not God's will. And then my Sunday school teacher in high school was a gay man. The priest that I worked for when I was a seminarian in my fieldwork parish was a gay man. The priest that I worked for when I was a curate, first out of seminary, was a gay man. Many of them had to be closeted at that time, but I saw in them the Holy Spirit. I saw in them the grace of God. I started to look in a new way. My mind was open. I changed from judgment to curiosity to openness, and slowly my heart was converted. More recently, I struggled with the issue of transgender people. Thought, this just seems weird to me. I don't know what to do with it. And then God put into my life a number of people. One was a young person that I had known when I was in college and seminary. And when they came out as transgender, it started that process. And then a few years ago, my best friend from seminary, who I'd worked in the kitchen with, been in study groups with, talked with all the time on the phone, said to me, I'm afraid to tell you this, but I'm actually transgender. And there was a pause, and I suddenly had to make a decision. How am I going to respond to this person that I love more than almost anybody else in my life? And it began to change my heart and my mind, right? Change happens for me through relationships. That is, I think, what's going on in our gospel today. Jesus uniquely sees this blind man as a full human being, deserving of dignity, having a full identity in God's presence. He invites this man into the new life, giving him sight, but more importantly, that sight is a metaphor for faith. The man then is able to see Jesus clearly, unlike anybody else in the story. Even at that time, the disciples, he says, Lord, I believe, and he worships Jesus. He is changed. He is brought into the fullness of God's love and life. I believe that is our challenge in this world. We're going to face so many issues that come across our lives. We're going to be confronted with people who are different from ourselves, different in every possible way we can think of, politically, gender, sexuality, culture, race, all of these things. We can make snap decisions of judgment, or we can have a stance of curiosity. Tell me more. I don't understand. Can you help me see? And with God's grace, our eyes can be opened and we can begin to see one another as full human beings, made in the image of God, deserving of dignity, deserving of God's love, deserving of full humanity. And in that, even more deeply, we can begin to see the God who made them and us, the God who invites us to open our eyes to see God's hand at work in surprising ways and people and situations. And in that, to bring about healing and growth and faith, so that we too, with the blind man, can say to Jesus, Lord, I believe, and worship with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength.